Remove it. The command cracked through the hushed courtroom like a gunshot, cutting through the low murmur of voices and shuffling papers. For a moment, no one moved. The tension seemed to hang in the air, taut and uncertain. Before we get started, be sure to subscribe to Veteran Valor Stories channel so you never miss these fascinating tales of courage. And let us know in the comments where you're watching today. Judge Raymond Harrison, broad-shouldered and self-assured in his immaculate black robe, leaned forward with the smug composure of a man who had never been told no. His sharp eyes locked, not on the wrinkled face of the man before him, but on the simple six-pointed star resting against the man's chest. "This is a courtroom, not a parade ground," Harrison declared, his tone clipped and disdainful. "Your decorations are not welcome here." The old man, Walter Grayson, 84 years old, stood motionless. His hands, veined and scarred from years of work, rested quietly on the table before him. His back was bent with age, yet his presence radiated something the judge could neither command nor understand. The pale blue ribbon of the Medal of Honor shimmered faintly under the cold fluorescent lights. The words "for valor" glinted like a defiant whisper against the polished metal. Walter did not flinch, did not speak. The silence around him grew heavier. The bailiff, a young deputy with an anxious twitch, shifted awkwardly. "Sir," he said softly, his voice uncertain. "You heard the judge?" Walter's gaze did not waver. His eyes faded like a storm-worn sky fixed on the bench above him. Around them, the courtroom audience, lawyers, clerks, a few spectators, watched the exchange with a growing unease that no one dared voice. The charge itself was laughably small. An expired registration on an old motorcycle, a Harley-Davidson he'd owned since the late 1960s, polished and cared for with a tenderness that bordered on reverence. He hadn't contested the ticket. He'd merely come to request a reduction in the fine. That was all. But what began as a routine hearing was unraveling into something else entirely, a clash of pride, ignorance, and dignity. Judge Harrison leaned back in his chair, the faintest sneer curving his lips. "Mr. Grayson, let me be perfectly clear. I will not allow my courtroom to become a stage for theatrical patriotism. Remove that medal immediately, or I will hold you in contempt." The word theatrical struck the room like a slap. A few people shifted uncomfortably. A young woman in the front row, a law student, stopped writing in her notebook, her pen frozen mid-sentence. Walter finally spoke. His voice was low even, yet carried through the entire courtroom with quiet authority. "With respect, Your Honor, this is not decoration. It's a part of my life, a part of who I am." The judge's jaw tightened. "I don't care what you think it is," he snapped. "You're in my courtroom and you will do as I say." He gestured toward the bailiff. "Officer, help Mr. Grayson comply." The bailiff hesitated, glancing from the judge to the old man. "Sir," he murmured, "please don't make this difficult." Walter turned his head slightly, his voice steady as a steel line drawn in sand. "You would have this man lay hands on an old soldier, Judge? You would have him remove this medal?" He paused, his tone softening into something colder, more dangerous. "Do you even know what this medal means?" Harrison's gavel slammed down, the sharp crack echoing off the marble walls. "Enough! One more word and I'll have you removed from this courtroom." But the damage was already done. The spectators were no longer looking at the judge. Their attention had shifted to Walter, standing calm and resolute beneath the harsh light, to the gleam of blue ribbon over his chest, to the living history being publicly shamed by a man too small to recognize it. Inside Walter's mind, the sterile air of the courtroom began to dissolve. The scent of dust and paper faded, replaced by smoke and gunfire, the heavy thump of rotor blades above. For a moment, he wasn't in a courtroom anymore. He was back in a field of mud and shattered trees, the sky choked orange and black. A young soldier lay bleeding beside him, his voice faint, his eyes searching for something that wasn't there. Walter remembered the weight of the rifle, the burn of shrapnel, the ringing silence that followed when the shooting stopped. That medal wasn't made of metal. It was made of memory, of promises, of ghosts. He blinked once and the courtroom returned. The judge was still shouting, but his words had lost meaning, drowned out by the roar of remembered battle. In the back row, a young man in an Air Force uniform sat stiffly, watching. His name was Ethan Cole, and though he didn't know the old man personally, he knew that ribbon. Everyone who'd ever worn a uniform knew. The sight of it being disrespected twisted something deep in his chest. He took out his phone, thumbs moving fast. A message, short, sharp, urgent, at the county courthouse. Judge ordering a Medal of Honor recipient to remove his medal. Threatening contempt, names Walter Grayson. He hit send and exhaled, heart pounding. He didn't know if help would come. But he knew someone needed to know. Outside the courthouse, the morning sun gleamed on polished stone. The world kept turning, unaware that inside a storm was brewing. Across the city, inside the quiet hum of Fort Hamilton's command office, a phone buzzed on a polished oak desk. The screen lit up with the message that would turn an ordinary morning into a reckoning. Captain Ryan Miller, aide to Major General Marcus Thorne, glanced down, his brow furrowing as he read. He froze mid-breath. Then, without hesitation, he straightened his posture and crossed the room with purposeful strides. "Sir," he said, voice cutting through the low murmur of typing and shuffling papers. "You need to see this." General Thorne looked up from the folder he'd been reviewing, his gray eyes sharp beneath the fluorescent light. He had the face of a man carved from stone in service, creased, weathered, unyielding. He reached for the phone, read the message once, and his jaw tightened. "Walter Grayson?" he said slowly, almost to himself. "Yes, sir," Miller confirmed, already tapping at his keyboard.
"Sergeant First Class, retired, Medal of Honor, awarded 1968, Quang Tri Province."
"Lives just outside the city." Thorne's chair screeched as he pushed it back and stood. The suddenness of the motion made every officer in the office pause. The air seemed to change temperature. "Get the base legal officer," he ordered, "and have my vehicle brought to the front gate. We leave in 5 minutes." "Yes, sir." The captain moved quickly, his voice brisk over the intercom as orders rippled through the building. The general crossed the room to a glass case on the wall. Inside were folded flags, unit medals, and one simple blue star banner that marked the headquarters of a 2-star general. He opened the case, pulled the banner out, and turned to his aide. "Put this on the vehicle," he said quietly. Official capacity. That single phrase meant everything. This was no personal errand. It was a mission of principle. General Thorne reached for his phone again, dialing a direct number. "Get me the head of the State Judicial Conduct Commission," he said, voice low but edged with iron. "Tell them this is an emergency matter. And tell them it involves a Medal of Honor recipient being humiliated in open court." The line went silent for a beat before the operator on the other end stammered, "Understood, General." He hung up, turned to Miller. "Ryan, do you know who Walter Grayson is?" Miller hesitated. "Not personally, sir." Thorne's gaze hardened. "He's a legend. The kind of man this country forgets until someone disrespects him." He walked to the window, staring out at the tarmac where soldiers moved briskly under the autumn sun. "Men like him built the ground we stand on. And some petty bureaucrat thinks he can order him to remove his honor? Not today." As the general left the office, the soft rumble of his convoy idled at the curb. The base guard snapped to attention as the blue 2-star flag fluttered in the wind. The convoy rolled out, engines low but heavy like thunder still gathering distance before the storm. Back at the county courthouse, Judge Harrison had grown more comfortable in his role as tormentor. He mistook Walter's silence for surrender. "So," Harrison drawled, leaning back in his chair, "you've decided to see reason. Mr. Grayson, good. Now hand over the medal to the bailiff and we can proceed with your fine. Otherwise I'll hold you overnight in contempt of court." He smiled, slow and cruel, the kind of smile that came from unchecked power. But Walter said nothing. He stood still, every breath deliberate, the weight of decades in his silence. The bailiff's hand twitched, reluctant. "Sir, please." Before he could finish, the courtroom doors burst open. The sound echoed off the marble walls like an explosion. Every head turned. 2 uniformed military police officers marched in, their boots sharp against the tile. Behind them came Major General Thorne, the gold stars on his shoulders catching the light like flares in a dark sea. The courtroom froze. The judge blinked, confused. "What is the meaning of this?" Thorne didn't answer. He walked the length of the courtroom, each step measured, deliberate, his gaze sweeping over every face until it landed on Walter. The general stopped directly in front of the old man. He didn't speak to the judge. He didn't even glance his way. Instead, Thorne drew himself up, shoulders squared, and saluted. "Sergeant Grayson," he said, voice clear and resonant, cutting through the silence like a blade. It's an honor to be in your presence, sir. A ripple went through the room. The law student gasped softly. The prosecutor's pen clattered to the desk. Even the bailiff lowered his hand, unsure whether to stand at attention or bow his head. Walter's lips trembled just slightly. He returned the salute, not grandly, not with showmanship, but with the quiet dignity of a soldier who'd seen too much and survived it all. For a brief moment, the air seemed to still. The decades between them, the wars fought, the brothers lost, the promises kept, folded into that single exchange of respect. Then Thorne turned. His gaze met the judge's, and when he spoke, his tone could have frozen fire. "Judge Harrison," he said, "I am Major General Marcus Thorne, commanding officer of Fort Hamilton, and I am here because one of my soldiers, one of this nation's heroes, is being disrespected in your courtroom." The color drained from the judge's face. "I hope," Thorne continued, "you understand the gravity of what you've done." The courtroom was utterly still, every breath, every shifting shoe sole, every heartbeat muffled beneath the weight of authority that now filled the room. General Thorne's gaze was unwavering. "Are you aware of who this man is, Judge Harrison? Are you aware of what that decoration, as you called it, represents?" The judge tried to speak, but his words tangled in his throat. He swallowed, his once commanding voice suddenly small. "General, this is highly irregular." "Irregular?" Thorne cut in, voice sharp. "What's irregular is your treatment of an American hero. That medal," he said, pointing to the pale blue ribbon resting on Walter's chest, "was awarded by the President of the United States in the name of Congress. It's not an ornament, it's a covenant." He took a step forward, his boots echoing on the marble floor. "Sergeant Walter Grayson received that Medal of Honor for his actions on April 4, 1968, in Quang Tri Province. When his platoon was ambushed, he held the line alone for nearly 2 hours. Wounded 3 times, he refused evacuation until every one of his men was safe. The courtroom had fallen completely silent. Even the hum of the air conditioning seemed to fade away. "He saved 12 soldiers that day," Thorne continued, his tone softer now, carrying the weight of reverence. And when asked later why he did it, he said, "Because they would have done the same for me. That's who you just humiliated over a traffic fine." Every word landed like a hammer blow. The young prosecutor's face burned red with shame. The law student in the front row lowered her pen, hands trembling. The bailiff took a slow step backward, his expression unreadable but respectful. Judge Harrison sank a little in his chair, color draining from his face until he looked almost translucent. Thorne's voice dropped low, controlled but seething with contempt. "You abused your authority. Judge, you turned a courtroom into a spectacle of arrogance." He paused, the silence vibrating with restrained fury. "But today you answer for that." He turned slightly to the gallery, his voice rising again, filling the room. "This is what happens when men forget respect, when they confuse position for power." No one dared move. Walter, still standing quietly beside the defendant's table, looked more weathered than ever, but also more steadfast. His eyes glistened, but not with tears. They shone with the kind of calm only earned by men who had faced death and lived long enough to see dignity return, even in places it had been denied. Judge Harrison opened his mouth, tried to regain footing. "General Thorne, I meant no disrespect. I was simply enforcing decorum." "Decorum?" Thorne snapped. "You called the Medal of Honor a bauble, Judge. You ordered an officer of this court to lay hands on a veteran for wearing his service. There's no decorum in that. Only ignorance." The judge's gavel shook in his hand. "General, you are out of line." Thorne stepped closer until their faces were inches apart. When he spoke, it was in a low voice meant only for Harrison to hear. "You don't know what out of line looks like, Judge, but you're about to." He straightened and turned to the court reporter, his tone measured again. "Record this," he said. "Major General Marcus Thorne, commanding officer of Fort Hamilton, present in an official capacity. I am filing a formal complaint with the State Judicial Conduct Commission regarding gross misconduct and abuse of authority against a Medal of Honor recipient." The judge's face went pale as paper. Thorne looked back at Walter. "Sergeant Grayson, on behalf of the United States Army, I apologize for the indignity you've suffered here today." Walter's lips parted slightly, his voice soft and gravelly. "No need for that, General. I've faced worse storms than this one. A faint smile flickered across the general's face just for a moment, then faded. "Even so," he said quietly, "this should never have happened." From the back of the courtroom, someone began to clap. One hesitant, solitary sound that broke the silence. Then another joined, and another. Within seconds, the entire gallery was on its feet, applauding the old man who hadn't moved an inch. The judge sat frozen, his gavel useless, his authority dissolving beneath the thunder of hands and hearts. Thorne turned back to him. "You wanted to make a display of power," he said, voice calm now, heavy with truth. "Congratulations. You just did. The difference is, now the entire country's watching." At that moment, none of them knew how right he was. Outside the courthouse, a dozen phones were already recording. The bailiff's nervous eyes darted to one of the spectators holding up a camera, streaming everything live to social media. The moment would be online within minutes, shared, reposted, dissected, and replayed across every corner of the nation. And within hours, the name Judge Raymond Harrison would become synonymous with arrogance. But right now, in that room, all that existed was silence, broken only by the slow, reverent breath of an old soldier who had stood his ground one more time. The storm had broken. The crowd's applause faded into a heavy, reverent quiet. The sound seemed to linger in the wood-paneled courtroom like incense after a prayer. General Thorne's posture softened, but his eyes, those steel-gray eyes that had seen too many battlefields, never left Judge Harrison. "You forget yourself." "Judge Gum," he said evenly, his tone no longer raised but colder for it. "This man you humiliated carries more honor in the weight of that medal than most of us could earn in a lifetime behind a desk." The judge's lips trembled. "General Thorne, I didn't mean—" "Intent," Thorne interrupted, "is nothing without understanding." He stepped closer, his voice lowering so only the front rows could hear. "You wear a robe and mistake it for power." He wore a uniform and learned what responsibility truly costs. The tension in the air was palpable. The court stenographer's fingers hovered over her keys, too shaken to type. The bailiff stood rigid, unsure whether to intervene or salute. Then Thorne turned back toward Walter. For the first time, his voice softened with unmistakable warmth. "Sergeant Grayson," he said, "you carried your men through hell itself. The least this court can do is remember your name." Walter's expression barely shifted, but something behind his eyes flickered. A glint of the young man he had once been, knee-deep in mud, shouting over the chaos of war. "It's never about the name," Walter replied quietly. "It's about the ones who didn't come home." The silence that followed that sentence was like the pause before a hymn. Every person in the gallery felt it. The humility, the gravity, the truth too heavy for applause. Judge Harrison sank deeper into his chair. The gavel now nothing but a useless prop between trembling fingers. General Thorne took a step forward until he stood beside Walter, shoulder to shoulder, one soldier to another. The sight alone told the entire story. One man's arrogance measured against another man's sacrifice. Then slowly, Thorne faced the bench once more. "I'll be filing my report with the Judicial Conduct Commission," he said, "and I'll make sure the story of this morning finds its way beyond these walls." He paused. "Because this," he gestured to Walter, to the medal, to the silent audience, "is not just about one veteran. It's about who we are when we forget what honor means." The judge's face was ghost pale now. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came. His power, the fragile illusion he'd built from authority, had dissolved under the weight of true respect. Thorne turned away from him and addressed the courtroom. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "if you ever wonder what courage looks like, look right here." He placed a hand on Walter's shoulder. "This is it." For a long moment, no one moved. Then the law student who had been scribbling earlier stood up, tears glimmering in her eyes. Others followed, one by one, until the entire courtroom was on its feet again. Not clapping this time, but standing in quiet tribute. Walter looked at them, his mouth curving into a small, almost invisible smile. He didn't need their sympathy or their admiration. He had carried the weight of that medal long enough to know what it truly meant, and what it didn't. He turned his gaze toward the window where sunlight cut across the dusty air, catching the faint shimmer of blue ribbon at his chest. In that moment, it didn't feel like a courtroom anymore. It felt like a chapel, and for the first time that morning, the silence was not oppressive, it was sacred. By sunset, the headlines had already begun to spread. Within hours, video clips from the courtroom had gone viral. The moment the general saluted the old man, the stunned look on the judge's face, the words that cut through arrogance and left a nation momentarily breathless. "A Medal of Honor hero disrespected in court," read one headline. Another simply said, "The day honor walked in." Across social media, strangers argued, debated, and ultimately united in outrage and reverence. Veterans organizations issued statements. News anchors replayed the clip again and again, dissecting every second of it. By dawn the next morning, Judge Raymond Harrison had been placed on suspension pending investigation. Before the week was out, he would resign, his carefully built career collapsing under the weight of public shame. But Walter Grayson? He didn't celebrate. He didn't even watch the coverage. He spent that evening where he always did, in his small garage, the faint hum of an old radio in the background, polishing the chrome on his vintage Harley-Davidson. The same motorcycle that had started it all. The world outside was loud, but inside, all was still. The rhythmic motion of cloth on metal, the quiet hum of his breath, the reflection of fading sunlight glinting on polished steel. It all formed a peace that no courtroom, no camera, could disturb. Then came the sound of hesitant footsteps on the gravel driveway. Walter looked up. Standing there, dressed not in robes but in a simple gray suit, was Raymond Harrison. The man looked smaller now, stripped of authority, weighed down by guilt. He removed his hat, twisting it nervously in his hands. "Mr. Grayson," he began softly. "I came to apologize. There's no excuse for what I did." Walter regarded him for a long, quiet moment, then went back to polishing the motorcycle. The sound of the cloth against metal filled the space between them. "I was arrogant," the judge continued, his voice faltering. "I thought the robe made me untouchable, but seeing you stand there, seeing that general salute you, made me realize just how blind I've been." The old man stopped his motion. He turned, looking at the fallen judge. "We all make mistakes," Walter said evenly. "The important thing is what we do after." There was no bitterness in his tone, only tired wisdom. Harrison's eyes glistened. "You didn't have to forgive me." Walter gave a small shrug. "Forgiveness isn't for you, son. It's for me." He turned back to the Harley, the reflection of both men flickering in its gleaming chrome. One bowed by remorse, the other steadied by grace. For a while neither spoke. The sun dipped below the horizon and a warm orange glow filled the sky. Finally, Harrison placed his hat back on his head, voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you, Mr. Grayson." The old veteran didn't respond. He didn't need to. As the former judge walked away, Walter ran his thumb gently over the blue ribbon resting on his chest. It caught the last ray of light, glinting softly, not as a symbol of victory, but as a quiet remembrance of sacrifice. Somewhere in the recess of his memory he saw faces, young men laughing in the mud, the echo of rotor blades above, the sound of a promise kept in the heart of chaos. He whispered under his breath, "It's for them." And then, as the last of the daylight faded, he smiled, a small, knowing smile that belonged to a man who had finally found peace. The camera might have panned out then, the humble home, the aging hero, the sunset glinting off the Medal of Honor, and faded to black. Thank you for watching this episode of Veteran Valor Stories. If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe for more true tales of courage and quiet heroism. The screen would linger a moment longer on the medal, catching the glow of twilight, not shining in pride but in remembrance. Because some honors are never worn for show, they are carried, quietly, faithfully, for a lifetime.